Hello and welcome to Wingin It. So we're back once again, this time with part 4 of the European Expansion Bootcamp as we get ready for the release of the European Expansion on Digital Wingspan very soon. So I'm joined once again by Tere. So welcome Tere, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here as always.
Good, and I'm happy to have you here. So we've taken a look at the various different power colors so far. So we've looked at the new teal powers, the new pink powers, as well as those when played powers that have been introduced in the European expansion. And now we're going to move on to the brown powers. So in this part 4, we're going to be taking a look at brown powers in the forest. So there's quite a few interesting new powers to take a look at that either gain you extra points or gain you extra food or even let you take additional actions. So lots of interesting powers to take a look at. But yeah, let's get right into it. So we have
All
got the
right.
first 4 birds here to take a look at, and these all let you cache food in one way or another. So there are some similar caching powers that we have in the base game, but these are quite different in the way they work. So yeah, how do you find these new birds in the European expansion?
Well, I think just looking at this power, I remember from the base game, a lot of the caching bird are, relatively cheap. They typically
Mm,
only cost only one food. So it's interesting to see that, a lot of this bird, like three of the four birds here cost more than one food. So they are definitely a little bit more expensive, but seems like they also give you some extra flexibility for the food that you pay. So it will be interesting to see if that extra food is worth it or not.
yeah, I think you make a good point, particularly the Eurasian nuthatch and the coal tit. You
Yeah.
compare these to the nuthatches that we have in the base game. They, along with the chickadees, they only cost a single food, like you say. So really, I think you are kind of paying for that flexibility and just being able to, spend that food for playing birds. And I think particularly in the early game, that could be really useful. Just being able to at least have that option to be able to use that and get more birds down. But yeah, I think the Eurasian jay is a very interesting one with that power stealing food. Obviously, not going to work every time, and it is maybe a little bit expensive, but do you think that's kind of worth the extra cost over something like the Eurasian nuthatch or the coal tit?
Mm, yeah, I'm not particularly as excited about the Eurasian jay. Again, like three food to invest in this
Mm,
bird that only give you four bird points. And like you say, stealing a grain is not guaranteed. And the thing I don't like about this power is also you might be stealing a grain from your opponent, but what if they don't need that grain anyway? Then now they have an opportunity to, pick up the food that
exactly.
they need. Even not that case, like grain is just the most common food anyway, so they might likely just gain the grain back if they need it. So yeah, there's not much damage you can do with this power when you activate it.
No, I think I kind of look at something like the Eurasian jay, and it reminds me a lot of something like the Clark's Nutcracker in the base game. Quite
Yeah.
expensive, doesn't get you a whole lot of points. Quite difficult to play, particularly in the early game, just with that 3 food cost. So yeah, it's the kind of bird, maybe you play it every so often, but I certainly wouldn't expect to be relying on this as a heavy usage forest bird. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the Eurasian Nutcracker? That's kind of the one that sticks out, I think, of the 4. Single food and 5 points is really nice.
Right.
And yeah, certainly some potential, I think, to get a lot of cash food there.
Yeah, I think my belief is, whenever you see a bird that costs only one food and give you 4 or 5 points in the brown power, like you already get your value back just
Yeah.
just by playing that bird. In terms of the power, again, I think it's not going to be useful in most situations because in most cases, you just get whatever food that you need and spend them. You won't
Mm,
have just extra food around to tuck them. I think it's only useful if you're running like a forest engine where you activate your forest a lot and you accumulate a lot of food. But again, since you already get good value from bird points, like even if you can get a few tuck, those are bonus and make it well worth it.
Yeah, I think I have to agree. Really the standout, like we said, it's that single food for 5 points is just so nice. And yeah, if you only get a few extra points from cashing some seeds, then you can still feel justified in playing it. I think I'm quite interested to see how this fits in with some of the other birds we've already looked at in this series. So particularly I think some of those teal round end powers we looked at
Right.
that kind of encourage you to take food. Maybe it's those birds
Mm-hmm.
where you get to play another bird if you take all the actions, or particularly those round end powers that let you discard food or cash food to get extra points at the end of the round. So I think certainly if you can combine this with some of those kinds of birds that, like I say, encourage you to take food from the forest and get points anyway. If you can get some extra points by cashing some excess seeds using the Nutcracker, then yeah, I think certainly there is some potential for big points there.
Yeah, especially in the case where, like in late game, say you're running out of egg space for your grassland
Mm,
engine, so this open up door
yeah,
for you to, just squeeze out a couple more points from your forest.
yeah. Like you
Um,
say, I think certainly I've had games in that late game where you might only have 2 or 3 turns left. You are filling up on egg spaces. It can sometimes feel like a waste gaining food if you can't directly turn that into points. But yeah, if you have the Nutcracker, if you gain, maybe even just 2 or 3 seeds and are able to cash those, that's
mhm.
a nice additional way of getting some points.
Yeah. I do have a question about, like, kind of curious about your opinion on the nuthatch and coated. Now that I look at it, like I say, seems like we are paying extra food for the flexibility to cash in and spend it later. But I just feel like from my base game experience, it's pretty easy to judge, when you need to cash or when you need to
Mm,
take the grain, for example, with the Blue Jay. And even if you take the grain, you did not end up using it. There's always like the grassland that allows you to,
right.
turn them into eggs. So I don't know. I feel like that power is nice, but it's not like essential.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not essential in that, like you say, I think in most cases it's pretty obvious if you have that choice of gaining or caching. It's pretty obvious which you should do. If it's the early game, you want to keep that food, you want to spend it getting more birds down. If it's in the late game and you're not looking to play that many more birds, you take that cash and go for the point. I can't think of too many times where I've cached a food and regretted it later and wish I could get it back.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the luxury, I guess, that these two birds give you. And yeah, I think when you compare these to the nuthatches and the chickadees, they don't look that favourable. But
Hmm.
you can compare it to something like a blue jay and similar food costs, similar number of points. And like you say, it's the only real difference is that with the blue jay, you're making that decision at the point of activation. Whereas with these birds, you at least get that little bit of flexibility where if later in the game you decide actually I want to spend that cash food, then you do have the ability to do that.
Yeah. Actually, now that we're talking about it, there is one more advantage with this tuber is compared to Blue Jay. With this tuber, you're guaranteed a grain. I believe with the Blue Jay, you have
Right.
to get it from the bird feeder. So
Yes, that's very true. That's very true, and that is a good point. I think
yeah.
being able to guarantee that seed from the supply, and then obviously I think particularly if the bird feeder's not cooperating, maybe you're really desperate to get some seeds to get a nice big
Yeah.
point bird down that needs a lot of seeds, and you aren't able to do that through the bird feeder. I think these birds, yeah, that is another advantage, just being able to gain from the supply, and then obviously you can spend through that power as well. So that's an option to have.
Yeah.
All right. Well, those are the four pure caching powers. There are a number of other new forest birds that also allow you to gain additional food either from the bird feeder or the supply. So, yeah, we will take a look at those now. There's plenty to get through.
Yep.
So, I think we'll waste no time and start looking at these. So, I'm just going to ask you straight up 7 birds here. Which is the
Yep.
pick of the bunch for you?
I mean, you know me. I'll definitely be eyeing on the bird that is the easiest to play in early
Yep.
games. So in this case, the whiteback woodpecker.
Yep, I
Um,
can't disagree with you there. I think it looks very similar to the American Red Start that we have in the base game, but it just has that
yeah,
advantage of being one food cheaper. So certainly, yeah, getting that down in the early game and just accelerating and getting more food, very, very nice option to have.
Yep, I absolutely see, a lot of potential with this bird. The one food cost really, just allow you to either keep more bird from your hand or get, other birds down quicker. Definitely a huge upgrade from the red start from the base game.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a pretty straightforward pick for first place. Now we'll take a look at some of these other ones. So I think there's an interesting array of powers here. So we've got some that allow you to reset the bird feeder and gain a particular kind of food,
Yeah,
or something like the robin that lets you gain food that you've already gained on this turn. And there's
yeah.
again a very wide range of food costs and points that you can get. So yeah, I want to look at this black woodpecker and I want to hear your thoughts
Hmm.
on this. So, um, being able to gain all of the worms in the bird feeder. I remember when I saw this power, I thought it was a typo. I thought you were only supposed to gain one because I'm
It's
used to
too good to
those.
be true.
Exactly. It did sound too good to be true. I thought you gain all of them.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, how do you see this kind of bird playing out, particularly in the early game when food, can be quite difficult to get hold of?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, the power does seem very good. But obviously, the fruit causes two grub and a cherry. So if you want to play this early game, you either have to, pay extra like for food, or you have to pick up a grub to play this bird.
Right.
And then every time you activate, you gain all the grub. I kind of have a mixed feeling about this. I think this is one of those, like, on surface, on paper, it might be very strong because you're gaining all the grub, but it really depends on like how the bird feeder looks
Mm.
like. Because in early game, if like no one is gaining food, then you might be just stuck with bird feeder that doesn't give you a lot of grub. But obviously, like if you play this early enough and you activate your forest, more more than a couple times, you definitely will gain back all the food that you pay. So I don't think it's like, all good, but that there is some drawback with the power. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. It feels very situational. I think it's a bit like the flicker from the base game. So,
Yeah.
do you play that when there's only two worms in the feeder? Do you look for three or four, or do you hope for five? That's the kind of question you're asking. And I think you make a really good point where, if you are going to play this, turn two or turn three, you're going to have to gain a worm. And so you're already taking a worm out of the feeder that you could be
Hmm.
potentially looking at gaining with this. And yeah, the fact that, like you say, if your opponents aren't gaining food, if it's just you and you're really struggling to get that reroll in the bird feeder because
Yeah.
you're only gaining one food at a turn,
Yeah.
it can be very difficult. So I want to kind of stick on that point with the drawback of this and not being able to reset the bird feeder, and kind of neatly segue into some of these other birds that do let you reset the bird feeder and
Right.
potentially gain food. So we've got the hawfinch, and we've got the great tit, and we've got the bullfinch. So
Yeah.
yeah, again, of these three, are they any of these particular birds that you think are standouts?
So based on my experience, I have pretty good game with the bullfinch. So among these three, the thing I like about the bullfinch is first it costs two food, so that's less than the great tit, and it costs two different food, so
Yeah.
it's easier to play in the early game. And because the power allow you to reset the feeder, and then you can gain two different kind of food from the feeder. Based on my experience, like it's almost guaranteed that you're gonna get either a grain or a cherry. I mean, maybe eventually you can do a math video on this, but yeah, from my experience, you're almost guaranteed to get a food from the bullfinch. So I really like the bullfinch.
Yeah, I agree. I think the bullfinch is just so strong, and again, I think
Hmm.
with a lot of these birds, we can make a really good comparison with the base game. I think looking
Right.
at something like the northern cardinal has the same food cost, but that's very restrictive in that you can only gain cherries. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, it's from the supply, so it is guaranteed. But like you say, resetting the bird feeder, you're almost guaranteed to get at least the seed or the cherry that you can gain. So certainly that added flexibility of being able to gain either or. I think that certainly puts it a step above something like the Hawfinch that has a similar power.
Yeah.
But yeah, so just two birds left to look at. We've got the parrot crossbill and the European robin. What are your thoughts on these two birds, and where do you think they fit in compared to some of these other food gaining birds that we've looked at here?
Yeah, I mean, if I look at both of this, the pair crossbill costs 3 grain. That always make it difficult to play when you have to spend three of the same type of food.
Mm,
And then for the brown power, you remove one dice from the bird feeder. So I guess like the usefulness of that is maybe help you with your reroll, or you remove some food that you think your opponent might need,
right.
and then you get a grain back. I don't know, for the investment of three food, I don't think that power is particularly strong. Especially you only gain a grain from the supply. If you compare that to the robin, it's a lot more flexible. You are paying three food, but in this case, you gain a food type that you already gain in that turn. So you can gain like double grub or double cherry. There's just a lot more flexibility with the robin, and I'm willing to take a 2 points hit from the bird points to get the flexibility.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the Robin certainly, it does feel like a more flexible power. I think there are situations where that could work really well. Like you say, particularly early game, maybe you need, I don't know, two fish or two rodents or two cherries from the
Yes,
feeder, and that's quite difficult to get. And yeah, particularly early game, getting that re-roll to try and generate that extra food can be really difficult. So.
absolutely.
Effectively getting two food from a single dice in the bird feeder can be a very nice option. But yeah, that parrot
Hmm.
crossbill for me, it's just a bit too expensive. I think three seeds in the early game really difficult to get hold of. Certainly, it's not going to be your first forest bird that you get down. So
Yeah,
maybe it might be something you look to play in the mid game, just as a way of scoring a few extra points and just extending the forest out. But yeah, it does feel like quite a difficult bird to get down.
yeah. Like, I mean, you make a good point. Like, like the crossbill, like from my perspective, I don't even think it's that good up for like mid game or late game because, three seeds for 6 point, you can get better value with
Right.
many other birds. And then once you're in mid or late game, like, do you really need that strong of a force anymore? That's also a question. So it's kind of awkward for the crossbill.
Yeah, I think it's a situation where if it fits with a bonus card or if it fits with an end of round goal,
Yes.
that's where you'd look to play it. But certainly, if you're going for pure points, there's going to be better options, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, so we now only have two more birds to look at, I believe, and
Yep.
these both have very interesting powers that I'm looking forward
Yes.
to talking to. They
Yeah.
certainly stand out, I think, from these other powers that we looked at. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. So, both of these birds are going to let you play extra birds in your forest when gaining food. So, essentially, you have options to save turns here, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly early game tempo. I think being able to get a forest built up really quickly, can be a very nice option. So, yeah, what do you make of these two interesting new powers?
Yeah, this is a really difficult one. Again,
Mm,
this is, one of the power that I like to see in this expansion, but because it really add, additional level of complexity and strategy to the game. Um, I think my problem with this bird is that, for example, for the gold crest, you have to discard a card from your hand to play another forest bird, and then in the tree creeper, you have to discard an 8 to play another forest bird, and you still have to pay the 8 cost and the food
right.
cost for the second bird that you play. So it consumes a lot of resources from another habitat. So, for the gold crest, you need a lot of cards, and then for the tree creeper, you need eggs. So I think unless you have a really strong wetland that give you a lot of card, and you have the right card, because you also need them to be card that you can play in the forest. Otherwise, I don't know. I just don't feel like in early game it's that easy to accumulate that many cards to play. So this is a tricky one.
Yeah, I think it is difficult. I think for me, what kind of makes me look particularly at the gold crest as potentially a nice option is that There are a lot of nice birds that we will probably come on to later in this series from the expansion that allow you to get a lot of extra cards in the wetlands. So I think particularly, if you can set up with a couple of those nice wetland birds, or even some from the base game, and just spend a
Mm-hmm.
few turns drawing, you're going to have those extra cards that maybe you're not going to play, and that you either want to tuck those or discard those or turn them, into some kind of resource. And I think here, being able to effectively trade a card for an extra turn, in that you're
Mm-hmm.
saving that turn, not having to play a bird.
Yep.
I think that's a really nice option, and certainly, we've talked before, in various formats on both my channel and yours, about things like raven digging, or just building up that wetlands, and just drawing loads and loads of cards until you get something that's good. I think with a
Mm-hmm.
bird like the Goldcrest, if you have that early on, you can afford to do that. You can afford to spend turns drawing lots of cards, because okay, I'm going to have some extra ones here that I can look to discard and get some extra turns. So certainly a good option there. But yeah, I think, one interesting combo that I've never had the chance to try out, but certainly, makes me think about the potential is, what about something like the tree creeper and the pelleted woodpecker? So that's going to be something
Mm.
that gets you eggs in the forest,
Yes.
and then you can immediately discard those and play extra birds. That to me feels like it has potential to be a really nice combo.
Yeah. That is nice. But I guess I do have a couple questions that, I think about when I look at this power. I'm just trying to think, say, obviously, with this bird, you want to start with them in the forest because they help you to build your forest. Um, I guess like how many times do you
Mm.
anticipate, you would activate this power? Um,
Yeah, I think that's
because
that's that's the big question. That's kind of the $1 million question.
yeah.
If you can get 3 or 4 uses out of this, and you're saving
Mhm.
yourself those turns where you don't have to spend a turn playing a bird, you can just say, well, I was going to play this bird, but actually I can gain food and I can play it anyway because I've got spare cards, or I've got spare eggs that I can discard. So I would say if you can get at least three. I mean, potentially even at least just two. If
Mhm.
you can get some big point birds, I think particularly, again, it comes back to this question of being able to draw or gain food late in the game and actually do something with it, rather than just have it as a dead action. I think if you could, find a big point forest bird, and then in that last round you gain food and have the option to play it all in that same turn, I think that's potentially a good option.
Yeah, that's a good point because I'm looking at this, these are definitely not I would think these are not a good bird to start a forest engine because you already have a brown power that doesn't score you points or give you
Mm.
resources. Um and yeah, what do you think? Do they fit into like a forest engine scenario?
Yeah, it's tricky. I don't think they fit into what the traditional base game forest engine setup is.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
things like getting lots of cached food, or using things like the woodpecker or the California quail to get eggs, or the wood duck as well for getting cards. To me, it doesn't feel like they fit in with that kind of resource point generating engine. I think these are
Right.
more about that early game tempo, and it is about
Mhm.
saving those turns
Yep.
and very quickly building up that forest. I
Mhm.
think certainly when we look at really strong forest birds, either in this video or
Mhm.
in previous videos looking at the base game, you prioritize those cheap forest birds that maybe only cost a single food, and that you can get down very quickly and that are going to generate you points or food. And so I think being able to get a couple of those down really quickly with these kind of birds, I think that's where their real strength come in for me.
Yeah. And I guess this also remind me of, in the base game, we also have a lot of birds that allows you to, when play, you can play another bird in the same
Right.
habitat.
Yep.
I guess like how do you think those power compare to this?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Obviously, those are kind of single use.
Mm-hmm.
So you can play two or potentially three birds in that same turn, depending on how many of those double powers you have. Yeah, I think these are essentially like the repeated version of those. Obviously, like you say, you can kind of use these multiple times throughout the game if you are gaining food. I think these have potential to be stronger, in the long term
Yeah.
because you can use it
Hmm.
multiple times. But they are, going to get you maybe fewer points than those kinds of birds in that situation. But yeah, I'm interested to see how these birds play out. I think
Yeah.
for me, these feel like the freshest of all the forest powers in just
Yeah.
how different they are. And yeah, I'm interested to see how people adjust to these and how these can be included in a sort of new forest engine strategy that we might see in the competitive scene very soon.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, not gonna lie, I am a little bit intimidated by this power because,
Yeah.
I just not familiar with them, and seems like you need to, have a lot of resources to support this. But yeah, I suspect that because if you use this in a good way, like the value that you generated from saving turn is just so much, like it can really be a strong strategy, especially in competitive wingspan. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. All right. Well, that's all of the brown power forest birds we're going to look at today. So thank you again, Terry, for joining me. I hope you enjoyed going through all of those new powers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like any other power birds, I think the new expansion definitely brings a lot of new brown power that I think will spice up the game. Especially with the two power that we just saw. And then I also like the fact that they introduce a lot more birds that allows you to gain food more easily. Because in the base game, gaining food from the forest is always a struggle, and whoever has the bird that allows you to gain more resources from the forest always have a big advantage. So I think that this adds some balance with this introduction of new birds that allows you to gain extra food.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm definitely looking forward to making the most of these new powers. But yeah, thank you for watching, and do stick around, subscribe to both of our channels, and keep your eyes peeled for the next part of this series, where we're going to be taking a look at brown powers in the grasslands.
Yeah, thank you.